Facebook has more users than any country has population. It has more control over the discourse in that sense than any sort of previous company has had. It decides which news stories you see, it decides the tenor of the conversation, and it's being asked by quite a lot of governments to decide the limits of speech and to decide it in the context of big electoral issues. Should this political party, which is allowed to stand for office in a country, be allowed a Facebook page? And we are having situations where legitimate, in a legal sense, political parties are being banned from a social network where places are. Now, I'm sure we all look at the state of Facebook and the state of the internet and want them to do more or want something to change. But how much of the process of doing it do we actually hand over to overseas corporations, control over our democratic debate? And I think we are at quite big risk of, to counter a small threat, creating a bigger one. So I'll leave my scene setter there, and you can talk to people who actually know stuff.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for the introductory remarks. I want to pull back a little bit. It's not that I disagree with anything that James has said, but in a sense, put this in a kind of historical, maybe philosophical perspective, and look at the fact that if we go back before social media and look at the advent of mass media, so talking about radio and television, especially if we're talking about radio, this is a period that actually coincides with the adult population being democratically enfranchised in the Western world, right? So we're talking about the 1920s, basically, okay? And so during this period, there is quite an active discussion about what the two things mean happening at roughly the same time, right? So a lot of people who in the past had no formal voice at all, especially women, are now getting a voice politically, being able to vote, but at the same time, actually, we have all of this mass media coming online. And the key thing about mass media here, and this was certainly said of the radio and television the same, was the immediacy of it, okay? And so the degree to which being able to hear someone give a speech, hear something happening as it's taking place at a distant, at a distant location, but nevertheless you're able to hear it pretty much as it's happening, right? That kind of idea, in fact, immediately created a lot of discussion about whether people were thinking that because they have this experience, this immediacy of stuff happening far away in other places, that they actually know something, right? So in other words, the fact that you're now exposed to a wider range of experience, most of which does not involve anything having to do with direct acquaintance in the normal way in which we acquire knowledge in everyday life to our normal practices, whether there was going to be some kind of simulated world, as it were, being created that people think they kind of know much more than they really do about what's going on, because perhaps the person speaking sounds very persuasive or authentic or all these kinds of rhetorical things. And if you know something about that period in the 1920s and 30s when radio really comes on stream, right, this is a period where you actually get quite a lot of people being very impressed by the great speakers, and often these people were fascists, and of course there were others who were not fascists, like Franklin Roosevelt and Churchill and people like that. But the point is, there was a very active debate about whether this exposure that the mass media allows actually in some way epistemically empowers you, or does it give you a kind of false sense of what you really know? And there were a lot of people who were very much part of this discussion at the time. I mean, probably the most famous one from the standpoint of the history of journalism was Walter Lippmann, who was very concerned and had in a way very much kind of like almost like a sort of latter-day Plato sense that in some sense, right, we have to kind of prevent this from actually having some kind of impact on people's judgment. But also within the sociological tradition, you have somebody like Alfred Schutz in phenomenological sociology. If any of you have a sociology background, you'll know that phenomenology is all about basically grounding knowledge on experience and so forth. And so he wrote a very interesting article in 1946 called "A Well-Informed Citizen." And the well-informed citizen is someone who actually draws judgments based on their own experience because they have direct acquaintance of it, but then defers to experts and don't just immediately. So if we're talking about the stuff that's happening far away from your direct experience, then you trust someone else. And so what he imagined was there's this kind of division of cognitive labor that has to develop in modern complex democracies as a result of mass media, where people basically trust the people who actually do have the first-hand knowledge, right? And this would be the professional politicians, the scientists, right? It would be people of that kind. And that would be the only way, he believed, that in a complex democracy you can maintain social order. Because if people start trusting what they're hearing and, interpreting it from themselves and feel empowered in that way, namely, I hear what this person's saying, I can judge for myself whether this person is right or wrong or whatever, that then you're going to get chaos. Okay? And so there's this very, very big discussion that's already happening there. Now, I think, fast forward to where we are now, because I don't want to go on forever here. I realize there's a limited amount of time. And we're in a situation where, in a sense, this kind of issue is is even greater than it was before, okay? But there's a kind of an added twist to it, I would say, that makes it kind of interesting and in a way more democratizing, and it's one of the reasons why all this post-truth stuff is probably not going to go away very quickly, so there's not going to be some kind of reassertion of expertise and all of that, is because actually the people who are now being exposed to all the YouTube videos and the Facebook postings and all the rest of it themselves have the power to contribute to this. Right? There is a reduction of the asymmetry there. Because remember, when we talk about radio and television, originally we were talking about a broadcasting model of media where there are a few people who are basically telling everyone or allowing people to see and hear various things. But now we're in a much more horizontal distributed universe where and as a result there's a kind of learning experience that goes on. So sure, in some sense people might be fooled for a little bit of time, but as they acquire the knowledge of how actually video and video things are produced and how they're edited and curated and all the rest of it, they're able to see through this. It takes a certain amount of time. And I think that's where the issue becomes kind of interesting from a political standpoint. Namely, can you tolerate the time lag, you might say, right? Where something like Cambridge Analytica, let's say, becomes this very surprising thing that seems to destabilize the way we do politics, to when people start to really understand how it works and lots of people are doing kind of the same thing. In which case then it gets kind of normalized and people know how to interpret it. Okay? And I think this is kind of more what the state of play is on this, right? Where there's a sense in which we have all this technology, gives us all of this access, but we're also becoming more adept at it, right? And that adeptness in our being able to use the technology is actually part of what is reducing the distinction between the experts and the non-experts as traditionally understood. And so from that standpoint, I think one should be somewhat cautiously optimistic, you might say, and we sort of should be riding through stuff like Trump and Brexit and all the rest of it. But at the end of the day, this is part of what I think democratic education is ultimately about. So I'll stop there.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so I was going to focus on the relationship between social media and democracy. In particular, social media has been the target of a lot of criticism lately, especially when it comes to whether or not we engage in or we exhibit the sorts of deliberative merits that democratic theorists hope that people would when you're engaged in kind of civic deliberation. And so you've got people like Jonathan Haidt saying that social media is one of our biggest problems, and Regina Rini, who's a political philosopher out in Toronto, talking about how social media and democracy are incompatible. And in a way, I think I'm lining up a bit with James here in the sense that I thought I was going to be the only somewhat optimistic person on the panel, talking about some ways in which the concerns with social media have been overblown. So I've been doing just some research in a lot of the empirical literature that's coming out of communication studies and psychology and things like that. So I was hoping to report some of that with you. But really, yeah, the interest I have in is whether or not things like Facebook and Twitter are creating these sorts of echo chambers that people are worried about, whether or not we should be worried about filtering mechanisms. I think probably not as much as people have made it out to think. And in terms of fake news, I think it's a bit more complicated. There's definitely disinformation campaigns that we need to be worried about, Russian propaganda efforts, but I'm less going to talk about that. So it's clear that social media has reshaped our media landscape in at least two fundamental ways, right? So one has to do with this kind of inward direction where its news consumption has changed. So as a lot of data shows, more and more people are getting their news through social media. In the States, it's at least, I think, 62, maybe 65% of people get some at least of their news from social media. And I think in the UK, it's at least 50%. So there's these kind of consumption patterns that changed about the news, but also kind of the way in which we engage in political conversation. So the outward direction, the expression of political views is now taking place more and more in online environments, right? So social media has inherited, in a way, a large part of the political discourse that's been happening in society. And now Facebook in particular and Twitter are hosting a large amount of the kind of political conversation that's been going on. And it raises all sorts of, I think, interesting questions about whether or not online environments are conducive towards people exhibiting the kinds of deliberative merits that we would hope that they would exhibit when engaging in conversation about political issues amongst fellow citizens, especially those with whom they disagree. And I'm quite worried that it's possible to do that online, just because it seems like things like Facebook and Twitter, they lend themselves to short, fleeting moments, interactions, often with people, especially on Twitter. The data shows that things are far worse with Twitter than it is with Facebook when it comes to like the way in which people are increasingly hostile towards people who are unlike them and don't think similarly to them. So there was this kind of initial enthusiasm, these sort of initial happy thoughts about social media, because it was thought that, you know, as James started by saying, it really increases our ability to interact with people who are not just limited by geographic location. And also the hope is that it was going to increase our exposure to diverse views, because we often have these kinds of like second-tier friends that we're now in touch with that we wouldn't otherwise have been in touch with without the internet. And as our online networks expand, the thought is, well, that's just going to let in more possible cross-cutting views, people who have different political views from us. But there have been these three kind of big unhappy thoughts, as you might put it, or worries about social media. So the first that I want to talk about is fake news. So Apple CEO says fake news is killing people's minds. Hillary Clinton says it's an epidemic. The World Economic Forum says it's one of the main threats to society. And I think it's quite clear that social networking sites have allowed, or they provide a conduit through which misinformation can spread. So that's certainly clear. It's a further question whether or not this kind of fake news epidemic is reaching as many people as you think, and in a second I'll talk about maybe it's not. So there's fake news, there's filter bubbles, where these come in two forms, right? So the first tends to be kind of user-driven, where people self-select. So you can think about like your news feed or not following certain people who have views that you don't like to hear about. And then the second one's much more system-driven, right? Where it's that there's kind of these complex algorithms which dictate the kind of information you're exposed to. And people have worried about filter bubbles mainly because they're seen as instrumental in creating echo chambers, right? Which I think is a big worry these days, that we're kind of in these environments where people encounter views that are just like their own and are reinforced, and they don't really encounter opposition. And the worry about echo chambers is that they've been seen as the kind of principal explanation for increasing polarization, right? And in particular, a kind of polarization which is called like attitudinal polarization. So it's that people have increasingly hostile attitudes towards those who disagree with them. And interestingly, there's some data out there which suggests that we haven't actually moved, at least in the United States, where most of the data that I get from is, where most of the research is being done, people actually haven't moved on the issues all that much. So in terms of their ideologies, those have stayed relatively fixed, but their attitudes towards people across the political aisle have shifted dramatically. So these two things come apart and they don't track each other. So one has to do with kind of belief polarization or political polarization, and the other has to do with a kind of attitudinal polarization. And I do think it's no coincidence that this kind of massive increase in attitudinal polarization has coincided with the kind of development in internet technology. But I'm still not quite sure how to make sense of this, because also what you find is that the people who are the most increased in terms of their polarized attitudes towards those who disagree with them are the ones who are the least likely to use the internet, the least likely to be on social media. So the biggest leaps in polarization you find in people who are like 65 plus, and they're also the demographic group that uses these technologies the least. I think there's something weird about that, right? Because on the one hand, there's this simultaneous growth, but on the other hand, it doesn't seem explanatory if you look at just the demographics. So that's kind of a bit weird. So there's this question about whether or not these sorts of worries about filter bubbles, echo chambers, fake news are justified. And yeah, I'll just kind of close by reporting some of the stuff here that I've been reading, where within the past 2-3 years, a lot of people have been collecting data on whether or not we can back this up empirically, because right now it's mostly just been unsubstantiated fear, I think. And it turns out that a lot of these worries have just been overblown. So it looks like there's a great paper by Matt Gentzkow at Stanford on ideological segregation online and offline, and what he finds is that contrary to people like Cass Sunstein, who really worried about echo chambers online and who mistakenly thought that offline people were more likely to encounter heterogeneous views when you're engaging with people in like your neighbors, that doesn't happen. In fact, you're much more likely to find ideological segregation offline in conversations compared to online. So that worry seemed to be overblown. Pew Research also finds that there tends to be a lot of people on Facebook, for instance, are often surprised by the views that their friends hold. that they seem to find that friends often hold political views that they didn't think that they held. But what ends up happening is that these kinds of disagreements often go uncommented upon. So they don't really say anything, but they do report that they're often surprised by their friends' views. And then also there's this importance about the role of social endorsements that these have allowed. So the news, and this relates to Steve's point, I think, about how the news has become more horizontal in a way, is increasingly socialized, right? So now it's the case that a lot of the news that we're reading, if we're going through social media, is done by, we don't select a particular general source of information, but rather we select stories from different sources of information, right? And because our social networks tend to be much broader than they used to be as a result of social media, and we have these second-tier friends who have views which are maybe different from those in our immediate environment, they're going to endorse certain kinds of stories which are maybe going to be from sources we otherwise would not have seen. And so, I'll kind of wrap it up there, but there is this kind of, there's been a lot of concern about these sorts of things, but it seems like the empirical data just really isn't backing it up. This still leaves a lot of questions about like whether or not online environments are conducive to having productive political conversations. I'm very skeptical that they are. So you might think that the mere fact that we're exposed to more diverse views isn't really that helpful, because we don't care so much about just exposure, what turns up in your newsfeed. We care about engagement, right? Whether or not people are clicking through, reading them. And most of these studies tend to just look at kind of mere exposure, because it's really hard to check whether or not people are actually processing, uptaking, engaging in the kind of having the sort of engagement with the contrary views that you'd hope they would. That's a bit of a pessimistic way to end, but it's that it looks like we're getting a lot of exposure, and then a kind of open-ended question is whether or not that exposure itself is doing the work people hoped it would do, because there's still this further question about political engagement, conversation, and being open-minded towards views that are unlike your own. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks very much for coming. Thanks for inviting me to this. I will squarely bring it back into the pessimistic realm. Maybe not so squarely, actually. And I will also zoom out a little bit. And look at this in terms of what are these technologies, what are the characteristics of these technologies, and what does that mean for the possibility to act. So for this panel, we've been asked to answer two related questions. How have the advancements in technology affected the media we consume, and has this been positive or negative for democracy? Of course, this can't be answered in 5 to 10 minutes. So I will sketch my recent ways of thinking about this, the specific qualities of new, specifically digital technologies, and their implications on the possibility for politics or political action, because that relates essentially to the possibility for engaging in democratic acts. And then in the session, we can perhaps talk a little bit more specifically about the role of truth, the importance of disagreement, the importance of speech as a mode of being political and engaging in political action. So there are, of course, a wide range of factors and facets to consider when we think about how we use technology, and specifically information technologies, and the way it facilitates a specific kind of participation in public, social, and political life. And my research generally focuses on the ways technologies shape our subjectivities. I have a book with the uplifting title, Death Machines. And in that, I sort of look at how military technologies in particular shape justifications for ethical justifications for particular acts of violence. So I come from the premise that technologies do shape our ways of being and existing in specific ways. And so online social platforms do shape, in my view, speech, shape attention economies and attention patterns, but they also produce desires and they produce ideas of what we want in specific ways. Here, for tonight, I'm just looking specifically at the temporal dimensions and how these temporal dimensions relate to the possibility of politics proper. And here I unabashedly become Arendtian in my understanding of what politics is. So Hannah Arendt's idea of politics proper is not the administrative management of people and goods and flows in a particular context, but in order to be a proper political being, one has to be considered as an equal amongst other equals. Freedom is important. We have to acknowledge plurality and the diversity of all, and we engage with one another, we debate with one another, we negotiate through speech. So this is an understanding of politics proper. We all know that information technologies are reconfiguring the ways we experience time in modes and ways that render it harder to engage in politics proper. So for Arendt, thought is fundamental to moral and political deliberation, which is constitutive of political beings. And to think means to withdraw from action momentarily, to not act and to not speak for a moment. So thinking requires an interruption of the linear time of action. Thought relies on nonlinear time, where past events, present conditions, and future possibilities all kind of merge and come together. So thinking necessitates a pause of the mandate of chronos, the measured flow of time. So when Arendt considers in her own work on dark times the incomprehensive triviality of what she calls mere talk in modernity, she considers that to produce dark times. Our times, I say, are differently dark. In our times, we act and speak continually, producing, if we follow Arendt, a public light that shines so relentlessly bright with continuous talk and continuous tweeting and expression, etc., that it casts very sharp and very narrow shadows for the possibility to pause, to think, and to translate that into political resistance. Decades of technological change find us truly enmeshed in a digital or a cybernetic systems that shape, if not dictate, the rhythm and pace of political life as an ever-accelerating chronos. In such conditions, perpetual reaction, not action, is the order of things, or order of the day, and everywhere the moment to think is replaced by the logics of speed, of informational processing. But the question really is, can we be political beings in a perpetually reactive mode? Can we be political without the time to think, when we constantly respond to particular action points? So what are the political consequences of living in these reactive times? And so the question I ask in trying to answer this particular issue that was posed for us to this forum, the underlying question that I kind of want to find out is, how do the temporal structures of the specifically digital ecologies, right, within which we are enmeshed and embedded, how do they alter the possibility for thinking and acting politically and ethically, which is a concern of mine specifically. And so I suggest that non-digitally experienced time and digital time have different effects on the memories we have and create, and the knowledge we produce and reproduce, upon which we then consequently act. So this is perhaps trivial, but to all of us it is kind of clear that the experienced time of physically engaging, or the experience of physically engaging with, say, a book as a printed artifact, where you have to turn pages and you have to read in a certain manner and sequence and spatial arrangement, produces a different memory and a different type of knowledge than a digital engagement with the screen. And here it strikes me that while many experiences take place upon the temporal structures of linear time and action, there's an experiential dimension to this non-digital experience that relates to the sense through which we learn and produce knowledge, and which is not necessarily beholden to the sequential time. So an experience can be re-experienced in a different time through sensory faculties and factors, an experience in time, embedded in and recalled through the senses. And we all know that if you listen, if you encounter a smell that you've encountered as a 10-year-old, and it reminds you so strongly of something that you know that you've created a memory of, there'll be a re-experiencing of this. There's a really beautiful and most Baroque account of this recalling, this production of sensory memory and the recollection of this in Marcel Proust's, when he writes in beautiful terms about becoming reacquainted with eating a Madeleine biscuit. And so the wealth of information and knowledge and trust in his own memory this evokes when he is reacquainted with this particular piece of pastry. Digital time, I say, has different parameters and has also different mandates. So in our present digital ecology, experience and attention economies are structured very differently. Where presentness is shaped digitally, our attention and experience is sharply focused, but also fragmented. A digitally mediated environment yields what James Ash, who's written this wonderful book called Interface Envelope, where he talks about interfaces, obviously, and interface design, where he says it yields a distracted present rather than developing deep modes of attention based around temporary elongated activities such as reading with your entire body, with a physical artifact, for example, video game producers, but also social media industries create hyper-attention, where increasing levels of stimulation are required to keep viewers interested in a single subject or topic, right? And we know that these moments of attention, these attention economies produce an affect. We very often respond emotionally to what we encounter in a digital environment. This in turn creates, and he calls this a multitasking brain, which is incapable of storage or sustained argument, which leads in turn to a temporal disorientation. And I would venture to say that this notion of disorientation that James mentioned before can be harnessed as a political strategy. Disorientation is an important way of, in my view, of making people less capable of engaging in politics or in political thought and sustained political thought. Douglas Rushkoff writes about this as well, and in the way we are conditioned to compulsively anticipate the next decision point. So it's not so much chronos, but rather it's a perpetual critical or opportune moment, a decision moment, perhaps more clearly related to the other of time, which is kairos, which this new attention economy creates. A perpetual present tense in which the past is not really fully folded into, but the past as memory is digitized. And this recollection, this digitized memory, is always filtered, is always translated, is always interpreted. And these platforms are not a naturally emergent platform. These are commercial enterprises. These are commercial platforms, and somebody makes money off of that. And so this knowledge production or memory is always, in this where as subjects are captured, nudged, and directed in certain ways, right? Facebook tells you what memory you should celebrate. YouTube assorts what you've watched, what it, in its own algorithmic ways, decides you should watch in the future and what you might be interested in. So, why is this important? I say that harbors a number of consequences for the possibility for being a political being and having political agency. An ecology of perpetual moments of action and interaction leaves very little space for thought, deliberation, nuance, fact-checking, or building trust. And this is really important. We've heard this, Steve mentioned trust. This building of trust is crucial, and building of trust takes time, but it also takes your own memory and trusting your own experiences in some ways that perhaps is a little bit lost with these very fluid digital economies. And there's also an issue with freedom, right? So at a foundational level, freedom is of course important for engaging in politics proper, freedom, speech, plurality. But the question really is this, what kind of freedom is this in this digital ecology? In which compulsion and perpetual nudging, pre-selection of choice presented as your free choice, and a steadily creeping, and there's data on that which I don't have here, but there's certainly data on that there's a steadily creeping neurotic and anxiousness in the contemporary body politic. So if we take freedom to be the absence of compulsion and coercion, then what is happening in this particular digital ecology? Perhaps freedom is now switching into a manifold form or manifold different forms of compulsion. And where we think about freedom in contemporary times or in contemporary political discourses, freedom is very often understood as not political freedom of the individual subject, but rather economic freedom. And this brings me back to the interest that is very often implicated and underlying in these social media platforms, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and so on and so forth. Economic freedom means that companies are free to innovate, that they should innovate, and here too is a particular compulsion, the mandate, the drive to constantly update, to constantly change, to constantly progress, and so on at a progressive speed. And so speed becomes really a virtue in itself, an unquestioned or at least an underlying value. And the recent discourse on artificial intelligence is extremely instructive in this particular context. So in order to think through what our technological advancements mean for democracy, we have to, I think, or that's at least what I want to do, I want to identify the ways in which they facilitate or hinder us as political beings. In which ways do they question or do they reshape autonomy, ideas of autonomy? And I would suggest that we probably are in a little bit for a bumpy ride. But in truly Arendtian terms, no future is inevitable. There are always multiple possibilities. There's always multiple contingencies in terms of how future contexts might unfold. I leave it here.
Thank you. So I just wanted to pick up on a few things there, particularly to look more at the idea of the way we disagree, and maybe how is creating this problem. Because so Michael, you mentioned that there might be something about the way we engage with these social media platforms, and that it might not be conducive to ethical deliberation. And I think that's interesting because we often sort of think of it as we talk a lot about the echo chamber and this problem of the passive information being all the same, and then that's entrenching you. But actually, there's something also about that they're not just. It's not just set up like that for you to passively take the information, but the social media platforms need you to engage. And what does that mean for the way we're treating that information? Is there just something not conducive to this kind of constructive disagreement about the way these platforms are set up? I wonder if anyone has any thoughts on this.
Well, I thought the point about the need to engage was interesting because often the people I think who do best in the sense of like have a lot of followers on social media tend to be the ones who are the most polarizing. So there's a sense in which you need to be disagreeable online if you're going to be someone who I think garners the sort of attention that you'd hope you'd have. Going the middle course, being sensible, isn't that interesting? And so I think that in some sense the ways in which it promotes having followers and the ways in which people tend to follow those who are more polarized or polarizing is unhelpful. So that's maybe one kind of way in which there's this need to, when you're online, they always want you engaged. And for you to be engaged, you're going to want to garner attention. And to get attention, you can't be sensible in some sense, like in terms of the middle ground.
Yeah, I think, well, what do I think? I think basically there's always been a problem in ethical disagreement of trying to get some common ground for deliberation. That's always been there in a sense. And a lot of philosophy has been about the incommensurability of different ethical positions. And this was before social media came about, right? That there's a sense in which very often when people are arguing about ethical, moral things, they're starting from very radically different standpoints. And in fact, one of the big conundra about ethics as a philosophical discipline, whether ethics can be rational in some sense, has been about whether there's actually some way to get some kind of common ground going. So that issue's always kind of been there with ethics, okay? Social media didn't invent that. You might say perhaps it exacerbates it, maybe that's what you'd want to say, but it seems to me that this is an issue that's always been there. And so I want to take a little bit of issue here with this sort of presumption, I don't know what, this kind of nostalgia, Aristotelianism or something, that there was this moment in Athens where people were able to sort of thrash out things in a rational, deliberative fashion, right? Sort of Hannah Arendt's fantasy, right? That never really existed. And it seems to me that if we're benchmarking political discussion against that, we're not going to get anywhere fast, okay? So there's a sense in which one has to kind of be clear about what exactly are the ideals that are, realizable that we're going after here. Because I think because I've heard several different kinds of ideals of what political discussion ought to be and so forth. But it seems to me that if you pitch it at a level that's fundamentally nostalgic and it's never been there before, not even in the period before social media, you're not going to get anywhere.
Elke, I wonder if you'd like
to we'll come back to that. I don't think Arendt is nostalgic in her super extensive discussion about what politics proper is. She starts from an Aristotelian or the Greek agora, but there's a lot more to thinking through what is required to be a political being. And it is not we all come together and then we have a chat and then we're all really nice to each other. But she kind of unpacks what is required to grant each other equality, what is required to take each other seriously, what is required to at least make an effort to grant one another equality and a voice, etc. And she unpacks that, and I think that is important. And this is kind of what we're seeing is not really happening on Twitter, for example. In terms of the social media platforms, I think it was 5 years ago when I wrote an Arendtian analysis of social online platforms. And what struck me was that the social online platforms are different, right? The way people are engaging with one another on Facebook is very different than on Twitter. They tend to agree on Facebook because they're friends with people, even though when they're not agreeing on the political views, but there isn't the harsh debate that clearly happens on Twitter. The other thing is with YouTube, for example. YouTube, and I know this from people working for Google, YouTube is algorithmically biased towards controversial content because that's what drives money. That's what drives, advertising, etc. So, this controversial dimension, this action point, it's like having to react to something that gets you in the, that is deliberate, that is wanted, and that has a commercial background. So I'm curious to see whether we should accept that as that's just what we deal with, or whether that should be resisted against in some ways or another. Not like a big revolt, but at least understood as what it is in that sense. I don't know if you've come across this as well in terms of your research in terms of the different platforms and different types of engagement.
Yeah. Twitter's especially toxic.
Right, exactly, because people don't know each other and they're really super keen on feeling something somehow. I don't know. I'm not
the
entirely
norms on
sure.
Twitter are also a bit different in the sense that I feel like there it encourages you to be short and cutting, right? Really clever and just take, like every word is supposed to be the final word on Twitter.
Yeah.
It's not supposed to open up conversation.
Just like the Greeks were, right? Like the real Greeks were.
But actually, this comes back to something you mentioned about public figures and the abuse that they often get directed at them from Twitter, and that seems to have got much worse since Twitter. Is that exaggerated, or is there something about the platform that just brings out the worst in people?
I think the points that people make about the platform are significant and are good. I think one interesting thing with Facebook, I mean, you were talking about time to think. I found with Twitter comments, even my own, I sort of, in my book, one of the very, very simple practical things I recommended is counting to 5 before you post anything. And the number of tweets of my own, I count to 5 and I just go, this is not worth the 5. I just deleted it. And I'm not sending something shouting, shut your fat ugly mouth, you cuck, or something. Mine are, I will sort of hope, a little bit more polite than that generally. Except when someone tried to use a dead journalist for clicks the other week, they got the 4-letter treatment. But you find it actually instinctively wants you to go in for that kind of thing. But I think while the format they might be able to change, I think the issue is the social norm. The most common reaction, as a journalist, you get sort of on a bad day a few thousand abusive messages. I've had days with 2,000 or 3,000 abusive messages. Twitter has chosen to allow those, unless they're very specifically racist, homophobic, or openly threatening, those are allowed. They explicitly, sort of if you report it, go, this doesn't violate the code. It's only if it's against targeted groups. So you can have, people will see hundreds of replies, incredibly foul, and that just becomes the general tenor. Someone politely disagreeing with you is genuinely often a high spot in the day, even if they're vociferously going, sorry, I think this is a really stupid article, but they give you a reason why. It's like, oh, that's lovely, thank you. Whereas, honestly, I can count on the fingers of one hand when someone's come up in real life and gone, you're a f***ing idiot. It's just not the social norm here. It's not particularly the social norm on Facebook, but you do see some very toxic Facebook groups. You don't see the fights in the same way. You see some really corrosively unpleasant groups, but they're usually talking about someone rather than to someone. But I think online social norms have just sort of started or gone into such a tricky place that that's a very slow movement. I think a few small technological triggers moves the culture quite sharply in a direction. And, Twitter is actually trying to change how its discussions look, to thread it, to look like a conversation, to try and match how other networks look. It's got the slightly longer character counts. But I think because of where the culture is starting from, I don't think they'll be able to design their way out of it.
Yeah, I wonder if we just need a brief comment on the power of the social media giants in this sense. And obviously, if the platforms that they're creating are having this impact on people and sort of distorting the way they engage. Actually, for example, when we're talking about particularly vitriolic nature of Twitter versus other platforms, I've started to notice recently some people using Instagram, which is generally considered to be a much kinder environment, and saying, I can't deal with Twitter anymore, I'm going to move away from that, and just starting to use Instagram to share the same kind of comments that they would have done on Twitter, but just getting a nicer reaction. So yeah, there's just something that very important about that they all have their different character. So in light of the fact that they obviously will be aware of this, do we need maybe a comment on the responsibility of each platform to think about the impact, the wider impact that they're having, if it's having that impact on individuals?
I mean, I'll chip in quickly first. I think I've got a thought and an anxiety on this, and essentially the anxiety is, well, the thought is that most of these networks come out of America, and America has a very different attitude towards speech than the UK does, and that Europe does. The First Amendment is quite culturally ingrained sort of in US citizens, in the US media, and absolutely in the US tech companies. And so certainly if the idea of regulating speech or limiting it is quite a controversial one, even where you might be able to cover it under the First Amendment. And so because of that, and because of sort of some of the discrimination things, they tend to come from quite an open place from a European perspective. We are culturally still quite different between Europe and America, and I think we underplay that. I think there's a bad habit in Britain of thinking of Americans as us with an accent, and it's a grotesque misunderstanding of the two countries. And so I think any coordinated issue, any sort of voluntary global type standards that they're going to work to, they're having to match two quite complex different standards. I tend to get particularly anxious that we're asking Facebook and Twitter to solve big societal problems. Nothing that I've seen of Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg makes me think I want to hand over control of policing all political speech to them. Do we think that the problem is that Mark Zuckerberg has too little power? If you do think that's the problem, then good on you, we disagree. Or, as I'd say on the internet, something much ruder. But we're essentially often just trying to punt discussions that we can't have in Parliament or that we can't have in civil society onto the internal workings of a for-profit overseas company. And really, if we think there should be limits to online speech, if we think we should curb that if that's what we're really asking to do, if we're really trying to control what each other can say to each other, we need to make that through law and through regulation, and probably on a country-by-country basis. We shouldn't be asking social networks to make the decisions for us. My rule tends to be, if you give these companies rules, they follow them. So Facebook absolutely despised Germany extending its laws on Holocaust denial to more severely penalise them if they were going to allow that kind of content in Germany. They sort of fought the law tooth and nail, and then as soon as it passed, spent a lot of money and complied with it. So I actually think it's a question for civil society, not for the tech companies. It's up to us to make better rules and up to them to follow them.
Yeah, this is actually one of the classes I teach in law school at Warwick has to do with this international regulation of the internet and whether that's possible because of the implicitly different regimes and the different, as you were alluding to, difference between Europe and America, for example. I think the first problem that one's going to have to face here, though, in dealing with this matter is it's not at all clear that once you put the data on Facebook or Twitter or whatever that you own it. Okay, and so I think so whether this is seen as exactly a kind of issue of protecting individuals is kind of an open question, actually, right? I mean, there's a sense in which, from the standpoint of all these social media giants, you've engaged in some kind of transaction with them, right? You've turned this stuff over to them, and they're promoting it, obviously, to make money and all the rest of it. And at the end of the day, it's their stuff. You have given them stuff, and what they give you in return is this facility where you can communicate and do all the things you do on Facebook and Twitter and so forth. That's the state of play, actually. That's the starting point, okay? So I mean, there's going to be a sense in which that kind of relationship would need to be changed fundamentally, it seems to me. The other issue is also, one could be much more explicit about saying, look, given that, as you said, right, Facebook has more users than any country in the world and all this kind of stuff, that in some sense these social media giants ought to be more integrated with the apparatus of the state, okay? And be made more explicitly part of the political process and not be treated as some kind of other with whom governments engage in, contracts and things like this, right? I realize that's an incredibly controversial suggestion. I'm not sure anyone really welcomes that in the Western world, but of course that's how China operates. Okay, so if you think about China and the way in which China deals with its social media issues, right, there's complete integration between the commercial sector, which provides the social media platforms, and the government. And then there are some norms that are set up that are mutually agreeable to these players, the social credit system in China, for example. And that is one kind of model that could evolve, which in a way kind of takes care of a lot of these issues, okay? And the interesting thing I would point out here, not I'm saying that the West ought to be going down this route at all, but the point is that Western governments are increasingly reliant on these social media giants for security information and for all kinds of things, without which then the governments cannot function, right? So these social media giants are gradually insinuating themselves in the sorts of things that we normally think of as being part of government. And there's going to be a point at which one has to just be very explicit, come clean, and really sort out what the relationship is, right? So in principle, one could make social media part of the state, part of whatever you want to call it, government, part of the way in which we organize our civil conversation with government involved. It is entirely possible. It doesn't have to go down the Chinese route. There could be a Western version of this, but that might be one kind of thing we have to start taking more seriously. I didn't mean to scare everybody.
Before we take some
That's
questions from the
fascinating.
audience.
So yeah, I just kind of agree with. So putting aside the integrating Facebook into the government, I do kind of agree with James that I'm very wary of handing over more power to these giant tech companies. Thinking about regulating speech, I mean, it really depends, I guess, what kind of speech we want to regulate. So at least two things have come up. One of them has to do with like misinformation and fake news. Another has to do with abuse. Right, and one of those is more, I think, in this context, tied to Twitter, and one's more tied to Facebook. And if we're dealing with fake news, as someone who's kind of optimistic, I'm really not that concerned, or not as concerned as a lot of people about the need to regulate it. But in any case, I think it's kind of pointless, because even if Facebook hired a bunch of like independent fact checkers to remove content that's then disputed and seen as misinformation, false, fake news, the damage is done. Right? A lot of the data shows that, within the fact that these kind of information cascades can happen online now, that information moves so swiftly, what ends up happening is that people are exposed to it well before we can get in and arbitrate and remove it and prevent people from seeing it. And if that happens, there's also, findings coming out of psychology which shows that even when you debunk information, it really doesn't matter that much, right? If it aligns with your pre-existing views, it's already kind of got you emotionally gauged up or whatever, it's done the damage. Even if you disassociate from the particular facts of that story, it's still done the emotional damage in the sense that you now dislike people who you view as from that side or something like that. So I'm not quite sure there'd be a point in the sense of its practicalities even.
Yeah, I mean, integrating the giants in the state I find really frightening. I mean, obviously the social, but China, I mean, there's a, aside from the fact that it really resembles Black Mirror's Nosedive episode,
There you go.
which is in itself problematic. But there's a real issue with identifying marginalized populations and discriminating against them in a really severe and problematic manner, especially in specific provinces in China. There's certain populations that really get the sharp end of that particular stick. And that's, that is always the danger, this kind of quasi-totalitarian way of utilizing a technology, sometimes for good, but also for bad. And quite right, the Google has reaped the backlash against being involved with the Department of Defense Project Maven, which uses artificial intelligence to sift through drone videos and identify potential targets for military purposes. So there's already a lot of merging happening, right? So Google with Project Maven, Microsoft is deeply involved with a lot of DoD projects. Amazon is going to provide the cloud service for the military, etc. Right? So there's a deep enmeshment of all of your data and military purposes and security purposes. So this is something to be resisted against, I think, because the two logics are very different, right? In theory, the state should look after the social and political welfare of its people. In practice, private entities are looking after their bottom line. And it is a fact that Facebook and other social media entities, they do have human fact checkers and sort of weeders out of controversial content. They are paid, they're outsourced through different companies. They're paid a pittance. They have to work really long hours and watch horrendous content. There are not enough of them. If Facebook really wanted to invest all its many millions that it has at its disposal to make a stronger, bigger effort at curbing controversial content or really quite harmful content, they could do so. But that is it goes, of course, not in line necessarily with its own mandate. Its shareholder mandates that profits must rise and returns on investments must grow. So the logic implicit in these two entities is problematic. And they will always clash when we bring those two together.
Okay, I think we need to open up to the audience now. Yeah.
Well, first I'd like to thank you for the invitation. I'm just a member of the public, I'm not an academic. I've not a graduate either. So doubly I should offer my thanks all concerned who are sort of listening to me now. I've listened to this and it worries me. I've been concentrating on the media and the different methods of media. I'm not a Twitter, I'm not a Facebook, I'm a great believer in YouTube. It's a great educator. If one takes this recording, which I hope is going to be in totality YouTube, if one listens to it and watches it in its totality instead of segments, as you can find on YouTube, if you look at some of the hearings taking place in America now, if you take the whole of the day's recording, and refer to it, much more educational than just the segments chosen by the site itself. What my concern, this I'm particularly interested in this event, because you put yourselves on the line now. The subject is truth. My subject is truth, the universal truth. There was a Kant, in fact, devised a method of universal law. How can we devise a universal truth and how can one come about it? Whereas Hegel, Locke, or one of the philosophers, he said to believe in universal law, if you knew a murder was a member of your family and somebody comes to and said, where's the murder? You said up there. You'll condemn that relative of yours. You will be telling the truth. Yeah. There must be parameters somewhere where you must draw the lines on. The other one is, of course, when it comes to political lies, parliamentarians in this country are protected in law to tell lies in Parliament. They actually knowingly make accusations of criminality against their own constituents. It's astonishing. If one compares that, which also with democracy in general, then of course it's often believed by academics, and I'm not an academic, I don't believe that Socrates was not a Democrat. He didn't believe in democracy because what we know is democracy. What Socrates believed in was an informed electorate. All these social media platforms we talk about are different methods of disseminating information. It doesn't necessarily get to the truth. If one considers that the ethnicities, different cultures, different religions, the answers in the Constitution of the United States where it recognises all religions and ethnicities. If one considers those, and each one of those has their own definition of what truth is, then if you have a consensus among those to write a universal truth that all can believe in and determine, then how would you determine universal truth nationally, regionally and internationally? I could go on, but I'm not. So, Jane, I also thank you for the invitation and your time.
No pressure.
Shall we cover fragmentation of truth? Who wants to start?
It's got to be one for a philosopher.
Well, you want to, why don't you begin? Why don't you begin? Because I am actually curious what you would say about this.
So I do think that there is such a thing as universal truth, but that's a different question from whether or not we can get everyone to agree on it. I don't think we can do that.
How do you determine it? That's the answer.
How do you determine
universal truth?
Depends on the issue we're talking about. I mean, if we're talking about...
No, what issue? National, international, or regional?
Well, if I'm talking about some basic truth, like whether or not there's water in this glass, then we can test it chemically, we can look at perceptual capacities, but if we're talking about moral truths...
That's not what he means.
Well, I'm wondering. All I need to do is establish that there are universal truths. There might not be agreed upon moral universal truths. I think that those are much harder to establish.
I think that's what he's talking about.
But I don't think that the fact that you can't establish that, you can move from that to rampant skepticism about universal truth, which seem to be behind the question. So I guess it depends which kind of truths we're interested in. I think it's a lot easier to establish that there are certain truths and get people to agree upon them depending on the kinds of truth we're talking about. And I completely agree with you that when we're talking about political truths, religious truths, moral truths, we're not going to find widespread agreement, and that's probably a good thing. It would be a very worrying kind of society, I think, if everyone agreed on certain kinds of ways in which you live the good life. You want some kind of friction. I mean, you find this in a lot of political theorists. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. But I do think you're right that these days, at least, I mean, this is an old problem, I'm sure Steve will say, but I think these days there is this kind of, it's not so much skepticism about there being a truth, I think. It's rather skepticism about our ability to access it, about the possibility of objective inquiry. I think that makes it a bit more complicated, but I don't think that people don't think there are universal truths because they wouldn't believe things so adamantly if they rejected that, right? Everyone would think your truth is your truth, my truth is my truth. They don't. They think they have the truth, right? So they haven't given up on the aim of truth, but they now doubt, I think, that people can engage in the pursuit of truth in this kind of objective way that you think would be necessary to arrive at it.
See, in a way, I kind of agree. I mean, I agree with the issue that people do believe in universal truth. I do actually believe that's the case.
How did you get there? How did you get there?
Well, yes, but I think I would analyze the situation somewhat differently in that I think it's not that people don't believe in objective inquiry. It's just they don't think that there's a certain group of people, like experts, who have a monopoly over it. Okay, so in other words, part of what's going on, especially in the contemporary world, is an enormous amount of skepticism about traditional forms of epistemic authority, right? Whether it be religion or science or politics and so forth. And that's not because the people are just throwing up their hands and saying, I don't know what's true. That's not the response, right? The response is that we're take truth into their own hands. Right? This is what this is what the whole sovereignty issue in Brexit is about. This is what all the Trump voters are about, right? These are people who feel that the people who supposedly have known stuff in the past have let them down and in fact are just selling them a false bill of goods, and that they themselves, perhaps because of all this access to all this media they have now, feel empowered that they can make the judgment for themselves and they don't need to listen to anyone else. I think that's really very much, I mean, if you look at the Brexit thing is a great example of this. The fact that people, when they start talking sovereignty, the Brexiteers say sovereignty, they're talking about actually the autonomy of their judgment to be able to say what is the right way to go and not to be told otherwise by so-called experts. I really think that's a very profound part of what's going on here. But this has nothing to do with people being skeptical about universal truth. I mean, it's just the distrust of experts. I think that is a real big part of the issue, and that's why this looks like a kind of crisis of legitimacy for society at large.
Should we be left to Providence to determine truth?
Well, that's ultimately what happens, actually.
We might have to move on.
Yeah.
Take another
Move from Providence? How can you do that?
That might be a whole other can of worms. Yeah, we'll take a comment.
Thank you for your very interesting insights. So I think it's really important that we look back in history, because I think it's definitely true when we talk about all these issues. These are not really new issues. So what's the relationship between politicians and citizens and the role of media within it? But I think there are two things that have changed, and the first thing is that we have an individualized news consumption now, just based on the fact that there are so many news. We're basically exposed to news. Everyone has different media usage patterns. And as you also described, the way of how we communicate is different. And especially when we talk about social media, one strength is that the role as mediators has diminished in my point of view, because you have the strength that politicians can discuss with citizens directly and the other way around. So my question is, when we take deliberative democracy as a desirable aim, how can we moderate this debate online when we only have platforms, but not really medias who can moderate the discourse online?
So, can I pick up on that one? So I would push back on the ahistoricalness of it. I would say we had quite a short era of mass media and a very, very long history of people largely getting their news through their social networks. Sort of, if not in coffee houses or in sort of places, through a mixture of some limited access to official sources, often weeks or months after the fact, but often from rumour, from travellers, from sort of merchants, from all sorts of other sources. And the sort of odd thing with the sort of social graph of news and people who get that is you've got all the issues that you had with that. You might trust your auntie very much to look after your kids. You shouldn't necessarily trust her to distinguish between 6 different news sources and share the most reliable one with you. But it's actually a sort of situation in terms of information that we've had for a much longer time, that kind of connection between our social ties and where we get our news. I think that said, though, if you look at the concentration in terms of where people spend time getting news, the mass media is still very much alive, kicking, well, reaching more people than it has for a very, very long time. So I think it's not so much actually about where people are primarily getting their news. That's still actually through a very small set of intermediaries for most people. It's just the way it's being sort of discussed and the context it's often being put in. So, one of the very, very common framings is, why is the mainstream media not covering this story? It's, scandal that the government's doing this, followed by a link to the BBC, The Guardian, The Mirror, or even The Times. And so the framing might be different, the angle might not be there, it might be very much sort of twisted into something different by the way different social groups treat it. But I think actually, I still think that you've got a hugely outsized role for traditional media gatekeepers, even if the theory of these networks and the theory of everything going on suggests you could easily cut them out. It's not really happening yet.
We'll probably just have one more comment on this one, and then I should take another.
Well, I mean, it's just something you said. I mean, the big media outlets work through those networks too, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, they're
Right,
implicated.
right.
It's kind of the same. So when I ask my students, so how do you get your news? They always say social media, but then they say, but through the big news outlets. So, but I mean, I have a question for myself, for you, about who is actually setting the agenda, right? So how direct is that access between, say, the Instagram account of Modi or Trump or whoever and the public, and how that translates into a news cycle? Like who is setting agendas? Who's producing the stories? I remember when I was in my previous career working in marketing communications, we would just send out press releases and hope that they would just be printed as they are, and they very often were printed as they are. So I wonder how that has changed or not changed at this point.
I mean, the era of live metrics is a little bit dangerous for this stuff, but It does also mean, I think the public are always far, far more implicated in this than they ever would like to be. You know, one of the oldest truisms in the news industry is that any time you do an opinion poll of your readers, they will say they want much more balanced news, serious stuff, much less gossip, you know, way less celebrity stuff. They want balanced stuff and more foreign news, please. Yes, that's good. If you ever do it, your sales plummet, your views plummet. You know, don't forget, journalists see what you really read, not what, you know, you tell people that you read. And so what gets commissioned more of is what gets read. This can create some quite bad feedback loops, but it moves on. It's often not what journalists want to produce either. So when journalists were trying to write and kind of really get people paying attention to Brexit, the public wasn't having it, no interest. Journalists were bored sick of Brexit by March, but it was getting read like crazy, and so tons more got commissioned. Trump tweets used to get huge numbers on news sites, they got commissioned. They don't anymore, so they don't. To a large extent, the media looks like it does because of what you read and what you choose. You know, the media you get, you actually deserve. Sorry. Now, you know, the news outlets are far more culpable, networks are far more culpable, but at the core of it is a very, very responsive thing to what is being read now. And it's only quite good editors and good outlets that will actively fight that audience feedback loop to sometimes go, this is important enough that it's worth losing numbers. And there are still a lot of those editors about, but they can only push against the tide so hard.
But I mean, I would say, I think, you know, in terms of this question of who sets the agenda, I have to say it is striking how Twitter can do that, right? I mean, in the United States, if you listen to CNN or any of this sort of, they often lead on Trump's tweet, right? Trump's tweet kind of provides a frame, and he does end up steering things, even among the media that are against him, right? And so we're talking about agenda setting, right? And if you look at the BBC website, of course, there are loads of tweets, right? Tweets kind of punctuate the whole thing and often provide a structure for whatever is being talked about. And sometimes with some stories, especially political stories, it looks like what you're just getting is a sort of alternatively threaded narrative. Right?
It's, I should say, I follow not the real Donald Trump account, but one that puts everything he tweets in the format of official White House press release. Because it's really useful to remember it. It's really easy. I know you weren't doing it, but it's easy to criticize the media for leading on Trump's tweets, and there are massive errors in how the media covers Trump. But each one of those is a statement from the president of the most powerful country in the world.
This is true, so why not? Yeah.
It is news if he opens
exactly.
his mouth.
Why not?
So it's incredibly annoying, and I think they're only very slowly getting better at putting when he lies in blunt, simple context in the headline itself, which is where it needs to be. But we've got to cover it if he tweets.
Yeah, I think we could take a round of questions, perhaps. We had one in the middle there.
Yeah, thank you. We discussed regulation generally, but I was wondering if anyone on the panel had specific thoughts about the government's recent online farms likely proposal to introduce a regulator to enforce companies taking action against harmful content on their platforms.
Okay, so regulation, hold that in your mind.
So my question is that from a sociological point of view, would you say that the fact that the political discourse is shifting from a face-to-face interaction to this somewhat de-personified or shallow domain of online reality, does it have a potential to influence the way people interact, not only on the social media, but in reality also, and potentially alter our political reality?
I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to add one more. I thought I saw... yeah.
Okay, so my question is kind of related to YouTube. It's one of the platforms that was mentioned, but I don't think it's as heavily discussed, and I think it's very important. And something that I've noticed when I've been on YouTube is this trend of political videos where you have a speaker that comes to a campus, and the person that has posted the video said, you know, Ben Shapiro destroys the argument of these liberal leftards or something like that. And I became very fascinated by that, because when you go and you watch those videos and you look in the YouTube comment section, which is a very dangerous place, you see that there's this like very polarizing discourse that takes place in that particular area. And I started thinking about the relationship between truth, this notion of rationality that these people have this authoritative claim over when they're posting these YouTube videos. They're saying, this is the most rational person, Ben Shapiro. He's destroying this argument. And what kind of role that would play when we're talking about deliberative democracy. Because certainly if we're going to contest that certain ideas are more valuable than others, there has to be a sense of defeat or conquest.
Okay. Do you want to start from this end?
Okay. Regulation, I mean, on one level, I kind of read it, rolled my eyes and moved on, because Theresa May is not going to pass this bill. She's not going to pass any bill. So it's, lovely letter, good, good fun, nice fonts, well done. It ducked every single difficult question. And so it was motherhood and apple pie to really everyone except free speechers. Who I have quite some time for. I think we can do a lot of harm with the intention of doing it. But basically, it posed a lot of questions, but we've been putting out papers that pose a lot of questions for a decade. I thought it had some interesting principles, I thought it had some sense, but this all comes on the specifics, and I can't imagine anyone in any of the tech companies will have been very worried by it at all. I think I think they will very, very heavily avoid the principle in there of duty of care, because it's quite a strange one. Facebook can facilitate a live video chat between two people. If you're having a video chat with your spouse and they start sort of screaming abuse at you because you've been cheating, is that Facebook's issue? To what extent does this duty of care count? How do they? It basically ducks any of the hard stuff and tries to it got them good headlines, it got them what they needed. What are the other questions?
There's depersonification.
I don't know, I'm going to save that for one of the actual academics. The one thing I notice is, of course, you see online culture and sort of habits come hugely into offline culture. I worked at BuzzFeed for 2.5 years. One of the things you notice is quite a lot of people, sort of my age or younger, actually say lol now. Just at the most basic level of how things move through. So if even the bits of speech and the idiom move through, and they really do quite quickly, how can it not be reshaping our discourse and how we think on a more substantive level? I just wouldn't see how that could not happen. As to the
libtards.
Yes, as to that. Those ones always really interest me, because it's only the framing that makes the content interesting. The content is entirely hopeless. It ties slightly to your thing of putting the whole video up. Almost any clip that goes viral, if you go round to the longer 10-minute version or you find the whole talk, it's deathly dull. And usually everyone did fine, and often something that sounds, when they're doing this person said an outrageous thing on the BBC and, how dare they? Usually if you have 2 or 3 sentences before and after, the point wasn't nearly as offensive as the clip makes it. And so it's really interesting because it's all about the headline. And so it's possibly the most interesting real-world study on framing effects you'll ever be able to do. And I hope someone does that study. But I do think it's, interestingly, for a video network, it's all about the text. And that interests me, but I think it says more about the attitudes of where we are with politics necessarily than the medium.
Okay. On the business about the regulation of online content, it seems to me this kind of issue, if it's going to work at all, would have to work at an international level, not at a national level, because you're going to have servers in other countries that are still going to be having all this offensive content being displayed, even if you try to regulate what's happening in your own country. So it seems to me that this is kind of a gesture. This is like a kind of gesture politics if it's understood purely as a domestic issue, even if they were to live up to what they say. So there's a sense in which this is where the international level of regulation becomes really important, it seems to me. On the business, let me go to the Ben Shapiro and the libtards thing. I mean, the thing that's really striking, right? So if you look at guys like Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson and all these highly polarizing figures, people will actually take clips but then frame them differently. So, you know, for every guy who puts a 10-minute clip with Ben Shapiro and then underneath says, you know, he squashes the libtards, if you look at the column in YouTube, it'd be the same video by someone says, what an idiot, what a racist, whatever Ben Shapiro really is, right? And it'll be the same clip, right? But it'll be framed. I mean, you see this a lot with Jordan Peterson especially, right? I mean, God, you even see with David Lammy. Right? David Lammy, in terms of the Brexit thing, right? Because he's very emotive and very evocative about things, and he gets framed in radically different ways, and you can see the same clip. And YouTube actually, because you know, YouTube puts these related clips to the one you're looking at, you can have on the side exactly the same clip with a completely opposite framing, which is very instructive. Okay, so my point is that this is instructive, and I think this is part of the, you might say the ongoing education, you know, media literacy education of the public as they experience this, because they realize, at the very least, that there are at least a couple of ways of looking at what's going on here. Right? And so I do think that's okay, actually. So I'm kind of generally sanguine about that kind of thing. Now, for the business about the depersonified online identities and whether this all, you know, change gives us an alternative reality and so forth, well, obviously the success of Donald Trump, right, which came about largely because he had a big social media following by being on that reality program, The Apprentice, the American version of it. That I think was very important, you know, in giving him this start to be able to go into the presidency. But the idea of there being a kind of media persona, right, where you as the viewer somehow think you know a lot about this person and you can relate to them, that is as old as mass media, right? That goes back to the movie industry and radio and television, where people who have never met these guys before all of a sudden say, yeah, he's my kind of guy, right? And so in that sense, I think what social media allows is a kind of pluralization of the kind of iconic figures, right? So, you know, it's no longer necessarily the classic movie star or the Franklin Roosevelt who speaks really well and all of that, or the John F. Kennedy who looks good in a very kind of, you know, classic way, but rather a whole range of people can now start to get this kind of role, and people start to identify with them. And of course, the more and more they're exposed on social media, right? Again, that gives you that kind of phenomenological sense of saying, oh, every day I'm watching a new video from Jordan Peterson. I really understand how this man's mind thinks, right? Because he's got 12,000 videos on there and I watch every one of them. And you feel like you're his best friend, right? I think that's kind of what social media does. So you get this kind of over-identification perhaps taking place. But the fact that people have been identifying with these kind of alternate presences they don't really have any contact with is as old as mass media itself.
Yeah, so I was going to pick up on the second and third just because I didn't read the white paper. So, yeah, so thinking about this, the way our online behavior influences our offline behavior, thinking about it particularly in terms of political behavior, it's a fascinating empirical question. The only things I know about it that have been studied empirically are, there's this one woman out in the States, Diana Mutz, who talks about how participatory democracy is actually kind of runs against deliberative democracy. And so the thought is that the more we're exposed to diverse views, the more complicated our reality gets, the less sure we are of things, the less likely we are to engage in politics, to vote, to engage in certain kind of political activities. And so one way you might think that our online behavior might affect our offline behavior is that if in fact it's true that when we're online we're we're exposed to this kind of diversity and it's actually having effects on our belief that it makes things more complicated, we're actually going to be less likely to engage in politics, to vote and things like that. Some people might think that's bad, but I'm not against less people voting. I don't think that you should just be voting for voting's sake. So there's that. And then also interestingly, and this one I know a lot less about, but a couple days ago I did see some study about how people who are participating in certain, this is kind of the opposite end, groups online that are very focused to a particular identity, not exposed to kind of cross-cutting views, those people are also actually less likely to engage in political conversation offline because they're much more worried about it not being a safe space, whereas online they can say exactly what they want because they're with their group, and offline they don't talk about it. So, yeah. And then, sorry, on the YouTube thing, yeah, I'd be curious to see, for a lot of these I'm really just interested in how the psychology works and this kind of empirical questions. I'd be really curious about, I read some stuff about how when people set up a frame that's incongruous with your experience, it kind of backfires, right? So if someone says, like, look at this person destroyed this other person, and your viewing of the video is that they're really not destroying them, you downgrade even further that kind of source than you would otherwise if it didn't have the frame. So part of me thinks that this is more just like team cheerleading. If you already identify with like what's going to be what the person's saying in that video, then the frame's going to kind of just maybe further boost your confidence in that view. But it can completely backfire. It's not obvious that it always is going to push people in the same direction, namely the direction of the kind of normative comment, right? But I think it is just a reflection of this kind of, you mentioned the sort of combative nature of people engaging in reasoning with each other. And I think that's right. I mean, you see this very much on Twitter, right? It's super combative, as we were sort of talking about earlier. And I think it all is just a reflection of the fact that politics has become more and more it's become more and more associated with just like team cheerleading. Not about the issues, not about policy choices, but just about rooting for your guy or your leader, whoever it happens to be. And when that's the kind of thing you're going in for, when it's not driven by policy considerations, because like people's beliefs on policy issues are super fluid, they'll easily shift. But what doesn't change is their identity with a particular kind of group, right? And so when that's what's driving us, I think you're much more going to find this kind of combative nature, and it's precisely what goes against the sort of aims of kind of deliberative democratic hope.
I agree with a lot what you have said, so I'm going to keep it brief. On the government regulations, I don't know that much about it, but every time I see a hearing, it feels like the people in charge don't really understand the technology that they're supposed to be thinking about in terms of what how could it best be regulated. So that worries me a little bit in that sense. I want to start with the YouTube. Regardless of which computer and which operating system I go to, there's always a Jordan Peterson video.
I know.
Always.
I know.
I'm not that interested even, right? So, and it's right. It's not just Jordan Peterson destroys this linguist. It is quite diverse. But that brings me back to the point that I made earlier.
English language.
Yeah, definitely. It destroys reason, really. It brings me back to the point that I made earlier that. It's never framed in terms of like Jordan Peterson makes a really coherent, rational argument that invalidate, right? It's like destroys the libtards. It's like it's explosive content, and this is deliberately so because this particular extremely polarizing content on both sides drives advertising revenue. The algorithms are produced so that they prioritize exactly that content. Now, why is this problematic? Because again, it gets us in the emotional, affective kind of sense, but it also normalizes certain ideas about what we should be doing and how we should be engaging with one another. And this brings me to your point, in a sense that online reality is so combative. It's not rational, really. It's combative. It's quite an emotive, reactive sort of way of engaging with one another. And so when we talk about disagreement is incredibly important. How we disagree matters. This is not a rational disagreement. This is kind of like a fight for whoever knows what reason. And so in the online environment, that's much harsher when it comes to face-to-face, like James was mentioning as well. We have a sense of ethics and responsibility towards one another. Like, I have to look you in the face and say bad things to you. I'm not likely to do that, right? Donald Trump is a good example. He was like cussing and cursing about Kim Jong-un. He goes to a meeting, it's like best friends, such a good buddy, great guy. It's different when you are with people. However, I do worry that certain things that are normalized, the Jordan Petersons in this world, Ben Shapiro's, that what they're saying and the explosiveness of this particular position, paired with actually quite a rational underpinning, becomes normalized. Mm-hmm. And people, it speaks to people because we are kind of a very fluid territory, right? It's complex, it's complicated, more information, we don't really find our way. And so these normalized anchor figures kind of, that's what people grab hold on to, and that shapes politics, and that's really what I'm worried about in that sense.
We have gone over time, but if you want to, I was wondering if we could have a very brief comment on, if I put the question to you, which runs on quite nicely from your ending, is how optimistic are we feeling about the future of democracy in light of this discussion? We just have a very brief comment.
I think we have a lot more agency than we give ourselves. If we stop thinking that we have tremendous power in shaping the online platforms, and we take into consideration that we are shaped through those platforms, we can try and draw some boundaries and utilize these technologies for a good effect, for something positive, for something useful, rather than sort of like drift along in terms of financial interests of those who provide the platforms.
I guess I'm optimistic about certain things that people are pessimistic about. So the stuff about filter bubbles, fake news, echo chambers. But one thing that still does worry me is just the amount or the way in which people can easily self-select the information that they get these days, just because there's so much of it out of there. It becomes so much easier to just find views that support your own. And I think it used to be a lot harder to do that. So I don't think it's the algorithms that are to blame for it. I think the individuals are the ones, and it's just aspects of our psychology which drive us to find views that confirm our worldview, just because it gives us comfort, especially when the world's so complicated and it's not clear what the truth is, that we're just going to then settle, I think, for what feels right rather than, the complicated nature of our political realities.
I would say I always try to take a long-term view about especially these kind of very deep infrastructure technologies, which I think social media is part of. I tend to be optimistic about it, but I think there should be no kind of hiding the fact that it's bound to change our value orientation. This is what every major technology always does. And so there is a sense in which perhaps it's a little misdirected to try to evaluate the full potential of this technology in terms of the values that we had prior to entering this technology. And I have a feeling that this issue, however, will work itself out as the generations change. And as you have, a larger and larger percent of the population who are digital natives, right, that will in a sense start to bring about a more coherent value horizon around this technology. So I think this will work itself out over time, but it'll be a bumpy ride.
Yeah, I have very little to add to that, so I'll just go. Yeah.
Thank you. So we will have to end it there. But I think our speakers will be sticking around for a little bit if there were any questions that we missed. In the meantime, please join me in thanking the panelists.